Bom dia a todos. It's great to see so many familiar faces. It is my honor and Don's honor to be here on Brazil Day. It's an unusual talk we're going to lead. It's a story of our relationship and a project we did together. Don and I met when he was a PhD student at HBS and I was an undergraduate in Winthrop House. How many people are undergraduates here? Okay. That was 30 years ago when he taught me my first ever class about business and transformation. 30 years. So we have bad news and good news. The bad news, this is what you will look like 30 years from now. And I'm fully aware how bad this looks. And it goes by very quickly. The good news is we're going to summarize 30 years of learning on how to make success in incredibly difficult places, in incredibly volatile places like Brazil.
The other good news is we're still vertical, so that's not nothing.
Yes. So Don taught me this class, and after business school, I went across the river as well. I moved to Brazil and saw a tremendous double correction with the tech implosion and Brazil implosion. And my startup was almost dying. And I did one of my check-ins with Don, who's been a lifetime mentor. And I was taking some time off from my startup. They couldn't afford me. And Don pitched me the idea of researching what it takes to be successful in places like Brazil. And we decided we were going to write a book. And we did write a book, which was published in 2003. The cover of the book is coming. No, the next page. That was the name of the book, Sucesso Made in Brazil. And the way we structured the book was much the way people in biology study if something is related to the environment or related to actions. We studied twins. And I'll tell you the structure of the analysis, and then Don will walk you through the sort of summary of the book in 3 minutes. But basically what we did is we chose 10 companies that had done really well during the 1990s in Brazil. And those of us that are older know that the 1990s were crazy. We had regime change, dictatorship, currency change, devaluation, high interest rates, very, very volatile time. And we chose 10 companies that had done really, really well in that decade of very high volatility. And to see if it was strategy or luck, for each one of them we found a twin. A company that in the beginning of the decade was similar in size, success, profitability, but at the end of the decade there was a big difference on how one company did relative to the other, and we tried to look at the differences. So we looked at Brahma and Antarctica, we looked at Itaú and Unibanco, and there's 9 other companies. And based on what we learned in the book, we created some principles about what it takes to do well in volatility.
Yeah, so that could have been it, right? We asked the narrow question, how did 10 pairs of companies in one country in one decade survive and thrive despite turbulence? We came up with a set of principles that seemed to explain pretty well the variance between, the more and less successful companies in the face of turbulence. And, and then we went on to our next projects. Martin as an investor, me as an academic. And, lots of projects start and then they just end. This one didn't. We kept coming back to our surprise. Like, we didn't expect this at all. But to our surprise, both of us kept coming back to these principles. Martin as a super successful investor, me as an academic, we kept coming back. And not just, finding them useful, but actually using them. So Martin will talk a little bit about how he's applied some of these principles in his investing and leading organizations. I work a lot with executives, and they found these principles helpful from, kind of Silicon Valley entrepreneurs up to Fortune 500 CEOs, found the same set of principles useful in managing uncertainty and turbulence. So, on the 20th anniversary of the book, which was last year, we were chatting, catching up, and we were both just kind of reflecting how critical these principles had turned out to be for our careers and indeed our lives. And so the principles are, kind of laid out here. What we thought we might do is say, hey, let's step back and kind of distill not only what we learned in that first initial study of the Brazilian companies, but what we've learned subsequently about these principles, and think about how they can be applied more broadly and what we've learned. And in fact, we're talking about the possibility of writing a new book, which would be called, the tentative title, is A User's Guide to an Uncertain World, that basically lays out these principles, talks about how they've been applied successfully in very different domains, investing, entrepreneurship, management, and people's personal lives. And you get, as part of Brazil Day, you get the sneak preview, AKA the beta test. So what we're going to do is walk through, we only have a half an hour, but we're going to walk through a few of the principles, give you a sense of how we derive them, what they are, and then a bit about how we've applied them.
Do you want to start us off with the backward view of time?
Perfect. So if I could, does this clicker work?
Yeah.
Yes.
I don't think we put the one chart.
We didn't. Did we? Let's see what happens next. Okay. Go.
So the concept of L view of time is, in a summary, success is not linear. Things happen, good things and bad things, such that predicting the future becomes very, very hard. And the more volatile the world is, the thicker the fog of uncertainty. And one of the things you have to do in a high volatile place like Brazil is deal with low visibility. Recognize that you have to drive your car with very, very limited visibility. And long-term planning becomes extremely, extremely hard. And accepting the fact that life is unpredictable is really, really hard.
Sorry, Martin, maybe if I could jump in, even if we don't have the image, let me try explaining it the way I conceptualize it, and then we'll come back to Martin. So we can't see time, obviously, right? It's impossible to see time. And yet we visualize time, okay? And a very common visualization is, imagine a typical chart where on the y-axis we have some variable of interest, stock prices or housing prices, whatever it is. And on the x-axis we have time, right? And then we plot a line. And the assumption kind of baked into this visualization of time is that the arrow of time flows from the past into the future, right? We have these kind of nice lines like housing prices going up, up, up. And this view of time kind of lulls us into, kind of subtly implies that the future, we should be able to extrapolate the future from the past. I mean, it doesn't say that, but it kind of implies that. And so when there are, when we have a nice smooth line going from the past to the future and something surprising happens, we call it a jolt or a shock or a disruption. Like that somehow it was the world's duty to be predictable in the way we had hoped it would be. Okay, so that's how we typically visualize time. How about if we flip the arrow of time? So instead of flowing from the past into the future, the arrow of time flowed from an unpredictable, uncertain future into the past. And the image I'd give you, we don't have a picture of this, but picture a seismograph, right? So you have a seismograph, and there's a line, that's the present, and you have all these lines going back in the past that are records of past events, right? In that picture of time, when we flip the L, when the arrow of time is now flowing backwards from an uncertain future into the recorded past, there's no expectation that we can predict the future, right? We wouldn't expect, you can't predict earthquakes. There's no sense in which you would expect that things are predictable, okay? So that's the fundamental idea. Instead of this normal picture, prices, time, line, shock, we have a picture of a seismograph with the line coming and events occurring, and you can't see past that bar.
The way I applied that in the following 20 years, my core business today is to make investment decisions at GA. And we're like a $100 billion fund. We deploy about $9 to $10 billion a year. And we have to predict the future. Yet the future is not linear, and it's highly unpredictable. But we're moving $10 billion a year on a presumption of a view of the future. 3 shortcuts. First, we reduce uncertainty by creating checklists and guardrails and simple rules that keep us steady regardless of what happens in the world. So there's a structure around simple rules. There's a structure around a checklist, things that you can anchor around no matter what the world brings upon you. Secondly, we create space for intuition we create space for intuition so that it's not just the science and the math and the data. There is space for intuition, and there's a loop back for learning. So it's educated intuition and a recognition and an acceptance that the world is unpredictable. So you build a little bit of buffer in your plans to recognizing that the world will be different than what the plan makes. And the plan, it's not really one plan. As you think of what the plan is, you don't run 3 scenarios in your mind. You run 1,000 scenarios in your mind. And then you get to the decision of yes or no to invest and how to invest. That's the first concept.
Yeah, and one of the things that's interesting, so at first you could just look at this, kind of backward L view of time where you're staring into this wall of uncertainty, and the seismograph, pin is doing what it's doing, and it could be pretty intimidating. But one of the things that's interesting is even though we don't know specifically what events are going to arise out of this foggy future, what the seismograph is going to throw at us, there are some regularities that we know. So the first one is opportunities and threats are going to arise, okay? Good stuff is going to happen, bad stuff is going to happen. And that's useful to know and useful to remember. It's not all, although people often frame uncertainty as just a source of negative events, of threats. It's not. It also creates opportunities. The second thing that's, I think, in a way even more useful to understand is that opportunities and threats in volatile markets can be modeled as following an inverse power law. And an inverse power law, what that basically means is that the magnitude of an event, threat or opportunity, is inversely related to its frequency. So what does that mean in practice? As you're going into this foggy future, as you're moving into this backward L, you're getting a steady stream of little opportunities, and worth pursuing, right? And a steady stream of little annoyances, little threats. And then periodic mid-sized opportunities and periodic mid-sized threats. But once in a while, every 7 years, 5 years, 10 years, it depends on the domain, it depends on a lot of things, there arises either a golden opportunity, where you can create a lot of value in a short period of time, or what we call in the book a sudden death threat. The kind of an event that poses an existential threat to your business or your personal life or whatever it is you're managing. And so even though we can't know the form or the source or the origin or the precise timing of these opportunities and threats, we do know something about the overall pattern that they follow, just as you do with earthquakes. Seismic events also follow an inverse power law that can help you to prepare and manage that uncertainty.
One of the things we observed in the book with these twins is that a lot of the time they did exactly the same things. And I'll show you, this is in the book, but it's basically looking at what Brahma did in terms of plant modernization, concentration of distributors, slimming down its sales force, and what Antarctica did. The strategies were the same. The impact was very, very different. When Brahma and Antarctica merged, it was not a merger of equals. Brahma took the lion's share of the equity. So it wasn't what they did. It was perhaps something else that they did. And the concept we talked about in the book, it draws inspiration on military analysis from the Korean War, where the MiGs and the F-16s saw each other in the skies. And the MiG at the time was a better, more powerful, more advanced airplane, but the F-16s beat them 95% of the time. And what it was in looking at the loops of these catfights between these jets, there was one thing that the F-16, because it was smaller, it could maneuver a little faster. And every time they faced each other, each loop, the F-16 would get a half a second or a 1 second advantage. And those advantages add up over time. And in a moment of war, a 4-second advantage is the difference between life and death. And sure enough, the F-16s beat the MiG-19. So going back to Brahma and Antarctica, Brahma was first more effective and went on to the next thing faster. Over time builds advantage. Mega devaluation in 1999, that advantage gets widened because of the stress of the environment. That creates the conditions for the merger, which becomes very, very advantageous for the both of them. So this idea that in volatile environments, you have to be fit, you have to be first, and you have to move on to the next thing. And even though these advantages you build marginally seem small, in a volatile environment, every once in a while, the power law, there's a big problem. And it's in those moments that the small advantages magnify. This one I use all the time. You know, in Brazil, Quinto Andar competing with Loft. In Brazil, XP competing with BTG. Globally, Gympass competing with ClassPass. Every little advantage matters. Focus on that, focus on that, and focus on that. And every time there's a moment of crisis, COVID for Gympass, ClassPass Des, Gympass, very successful. The drying up of fundraising for venture and growth. Loft, unfinanceable, distress. Quinto Andar, more efficient, had a war chest, success. Time and time again, marginal advantage adds up over time. Third concept. These are some people you may recognize. So one of you may have spoken.
Sorry, Martin, before we dive forward, I wonder if I could just, maybe let's pause back for a minute before we get to fishing. So maybe if you go back to the MiGs picture for just a second. Actually, let me just use that for a minute. So the key insight here was what we called from lines to loops. Okay, so remember, we're facing a future that looks like this, not like that. And the question is, how do you advance into that future? When you have very limited visibility into the future, you get a lot of threats, some big, some small, a lot of opportunities, most small, some big. And the core idea, as Martin mentioned, was this notion of not thinking of things in a linear fashion. We plan something, we do something, we march ahead, but rather iterating through. So in the example of the MiGs and the F-16s, for those of you who are in the military or background in aviation, you'll be familiar with the notion of the OODA loop, which is basically how the U.S. Air Force understood the success of the F-16 versus the MiG, because the MiG was better. It was faster, it lasted longer, it could fly higher. In every measurable dimension, it was better than the F-16. It shouldn't have lost 90% of the dogfights it got engaged in. It shouldn't have. But what the U.S. Air Force discovered was that the pilots on both sides, the MiGs and the F-16, the Russian and the Soviet and the American pilots, they were going through a loop where they'd observe the situation, they'd orient themselves, what's going on here, they'd decide what to do, they'd act, and then they'd go through the loop again. They'd observe, orient, decide, and act, right? And what's nice about that is that approach does not presume that you can see deep into the future. It's not that the F-16s had a better long-term plan and executed. No, they were responding to circumstances as they changed. And then exactly as Martin said, that's how we see a pattern like we saw with Brahma versus Antarctica. Brahma, basically, whenever there was a change in the marketplace, the Hayao plan, right, where all of a sudden you could no longer pass through your cost inefficiencies to your customers in Brazil, you had to have cost discipline. Basically, Brahma took a series of steps right then. Nobody saw that coming, or didn't know the timing at least, to cut costs. And they did it a little bit better and a little bit faster. Antarctica started a little bit later and was a little bit slower. And so when the next change came along, Brahma was able to loop through and adjust to that more quickly, right? So the core idea, as Martin said, is it's around when we're going into this backward L view of time, the seismograph view of time, we don't think in lines, we think of loops, okay? Like the OODA loop. And we saw that loud and clear, exactly as Marcin discussed, with the Brahma versus Antarctica. It's not that Brahma did anything better than Antarctica or anything Antarctica didn't think of. They just started a little bit quicker, finished a little bit quicker, and they could move through the loop more quickly to respond to the next change. And what's interesting to me as an academic about this is this principle of iterating through a loop when you have to act in the face of uncertainty in almost every domain of action in the face of uncertainty. Independently, they have come up with a version of this loop. Scientific method. Create a hypothesis, test the hypothesis, revise your priors, another hypothesis. Venture capital funding. Have an investment thesis, put some money in, the startup run some experiments, and when they run out of money, come back and you evaluate whether you want to invest again. And the key thing that I have found, this is something that I've spent a bunch of time on. The key kind of practical implication for this loop approach is around making revisions, how you close the loop, right? Because so often everything is stacked against people, organizations, investors, countries, fighter pilots adjusting course, right? There's a confirmation bias. We tend to believe and see behavior that confirms our incoming assumptions. There's the sunk cost fallacy. There's a tendency to escalate commitment even when the course of action is failing. There are all these forces that push us in a line, right? And well-documented forces. And so the trick is building that revision in on a regular basis, which for those of you, I don't know how many of you are working in startups or have worked in startups. Your quarterly OKR review should be exactly that. I'm the co-founder and CEO of a startup, and just last week we're doing our review of OKRs. And basically, we had a bunch of hypotheses in January, and then we see where we're at in March, and they don't look like each other. A lot changed. We were surprised. A lot of things, unexpected things happened. And so closing that loop by making revisions is the key thing that, all of the companies in Brazil that we studied did a much better job of than their counterparts that did less well.
So we only have 7 more minutes, so we'll do the third one really quickly. All the successful companies got lucky at least once. Some were serially lucky. They landed on these massive opportunities to reimagine their industries. And we tried to see what these companies were doing to get lucky so frequently. And the best example were the 3G guys. There's a crisis and they buy Antarctica. There's another crisis and they buy Interbrew. Then they buy the Anheuser-Busch. Then Saab Miller. What was it about, Alex is part of that group, what was it about these guys that helped them make these bold, transformative things time and time again? And they're all very different people. But there's one thing they do in common, which is a little bit the picture we showed. Alex's picture. I couldn't find a picture of you with your online presence is not. You're not visible enough. I need a picture of you with a big fish. They're all spear fishers. And to me, because I work for this guy, Alex hired me. I never understood this spear fishing thing. It's not very masculine. It's not very powerful. It's not like you chase the fish. You go down and you just wait. You don't have a tank, you just wait and wait and wait and wait and wait and wait and wait. Because when you went down, you scared the fish, and you wait and you see the little fish come out, and you wait for the big fish, and when the big fish shows up, you have 2 seconds. You're running out of oxygen, there's a moment of near-death experience, and you pull out the fish, and it's apparently very good. I've never done it. But there is a lot of science to it. You have to decide where to anchor the boat, because you want to be in places where there are a lot of fish. You have to be able to hold your breath 3 minutes. You have to be very fit so that you wait for the big fish. And you have to be calibrated and bold to move on the big fish when you see it. So we don't have time to go through all the details of what they did, but what's interesting to recognize is it all started with the acquisition of Brahma. which happened in the eve of Lula's first election. A transaction they closed with 1 week of due diligence. I think it was $90 million. A stroke of genius. $90 million now worth $90 billion or some number like that. 5 years before, Jorge had told Beto and Marcel, I want to buy a consumer brand that will benefit from the end of inflation in Brazil. And for 5 years, they were there waiting. And then when the Swiss owners of Brahma get scared about Lula, they move. And they do that again when there's a devaluation in 99, and they do that again when there's a great financial crisis. So there is a science to getting lucky, and it has to do with 3 steps, which is you decide where you want to get lucky. You build staying power so you can wait for the big fish. And it also means saying no to a lot of small fish. And then there's striking decisively once you see the big fish. So that's the theory, and we call it spearfishing in honor of these 3 plus Alex 4. But this perhaps has been the one that's impacted me the most. Investing is about saying no. No, 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 no. Because if you say yes to mediocre things, the big fish just passes you by because you're digesting the mediocre thing. And the hardest thing as an investor is saying no so many times.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of interesting things about this notion of spearfishing to me. The first one is it's intimately linked, of course, to this seismograph view of time, right? If you work under the assumption that opportunities will follow this inverse power law, you have confidence that ultimately a golden opportunity is going to come along. And as Marcin rightly notes, you don't want to dissipate your resources, time, attention, focus on, kind of mediocre opportunities. You want to keep some oxygen in your lungs to keep you there longer. So that's one thing. I think the second thing that's interesting to me about this is the importance of resource allocation for this, and really resource reallocation. Because in most organizations, investment firms, large companies, resource allocation it's like Halloween. Basically, kids come to your door, you give everyone a Snickers bar, everybody leaves happy. Okay? But if you recognize that, exactly as Marcin was saying, you don't want to get kind of overinvest in mediocre opportunities. You want to save your resources for the golden opportunities when they arise. You don't allocate resources, you reallocate resources. When a golden opportunity arises, you oftentimes have to pull money, people, attention out of other resources to double down on that golden opportunity. Okay? And so from a Halloween perspective, what that means is the kids come to the door, you trick or treat, you grab a handful of candy out of one kid's bucket and give it to another kid. It's a much harder thing to do, to reallocate resources, but that's exactly what you need to be able to do to really double down on those golden opportunities when they arise.
So we're thinking of writing the second book along the lines that you gave you a preview. Clearly for the money, because book writing is very profitable. The objectives are simple. First, the world's becoming more uncertain. Rate of change is accelerating. Geopolitics are more complicated. These tools perhaps are relevant not just in Brazil or in the high-tech sector. Second, personally, for both of us, we like to make business and entrepreneurship cool in undergraduate. I mean, the only reason I took a business class in undergraduate is we snuck it in as a seminar in Winthrop House. But you're not allowed to teach business in the undergraduate at Harvard College, which I find so forward-looking. And I'd like to try to change that. I forgot the third reason. There must be a third reason. Those are the 2 main reasons. The third one is this idea of academia and practice. My interactions with Don over 30 years have been so rewarding, and I've kept learning and iterating. And just because I left Harvard and I left academia as a 27-year-old, what a waste not to use that tool as a compass to help you navigate the world. And I wish more of us would do that. So those are the 3. So we have a question to end this. We are 5 more seconds. If we write the book, who would buy it? $24.
It's a non-graded class. Remember, you're not getting...
Thank you, guys. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.